Something about this angle looks particularly like an optical illusion today, but I'm just going to blame perspective and potentially old apartment building floors. But we are not here to talk about weird angles and old apartment building floors today. We are here because it is July, and that means it is time to talk about the books we've read so far this year. And specifically for me, it is time for us, or me, to do the mid-year book freakout tag. I don't generally do a whole lot of book tags, probably just because I'm not great at it, but I really do love watching this tag, and I did it last year and really enjoyed doing it, so I thought, why not do it again? Now, I recognize that I have not done a reading wrap-up for the past 3 months. I am hoping to go ahead and swing back and do a Q2 wrap-up because I have been in a little bit of a slump, so I haven't been reading as robustly as I'm used to, so hopefully we can kind of pack that all into one video because I do still want to talk about some of these books I maybe haven't talked about because they haven't been in a Feature Friday. So that is still on the docket. However, today we are talking about the most kind of standout books in terms of these questions and these prompts. So the odds are decent that they will have been featured in a Feature Friday at some point over the course of the year so far. But that does still mean that we have a lot of books to talk about. So throughout this whole video, I would love to hear your answers for some of these questions as you feel so led as well, but here are mine. And we're starting out with the big guns of the best book you have read so far this year. And this isn't as hard for me this year as it feels like it has been in prior years. I think the best book I've read this year so far is definitely The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Katherine Arden. I love the lyricism in that book. I love the way that it combines historical fiction and the kind of mythical, and the way the mythical stands in as a metaphor for a lot of the horrors of war, since the book takes place during World War I. I think that it utilizes a lot of the skills as a storyteller we see from Arden in her original trilogy, the Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, which I loved so much, and we see that transported or transposed onto a vastly different historical setting. However, in some ways, she is still exploring a lot of similar themes in terms of a world standing on this precipice of change. And to be fair, I think we are standing on that precipice of change more often than we like to think, but taking these worlds and these narratives she's created at a turning point and placing the narrative at that turning point, but then exploring the humanity within these wider events. And as someone who has been very vocal about the fact that I don't gravitate first to war narratives, this was really astonishing, and I loved what it did with the storytelling. I loved the dual perspectives, or the differing point of views that we got within the book, the way that it kind of moved throughout time, the way that it had a liminal space, and the idea of looking at the front and where within the front we can create liminal space, and looking at the mental health, the mental implications, the weight of war within this context. I just think it was a really stunning novel that takes a lot of what I'm interested in fiction, in terms of that historical setting, but also that bit of the mythical or the odd, and combining that with gorgeous prose and a beautiful voice. I think it really succeeded for me in that way. Now, I will say for some people that lyricism may be a hindrance, like that may feel like a block for you in terms of liking more plot-driven, action-driven kind of narratives. There's definitely a plot here in that we are following a young woman, an honorably discharged Canadian nurse during World War I, as she is searching for her brother who has been lost in battle, and also then following his journey and how these two people may or may not find themselves, or each other, I should say, again, and finding themselves a little bit in the process, but also finding themselves changed by the horrific circumstances of the world at this time, as well as a lot of like allegorical imagery. There is a lot going on in this book, but if you want to hear me talk about it in more depth, definitely go ahead and check out my Feature Friday on it. I also want to go ahead and give some shout outs to some runners up, or other books that have really been standouts for me so far this year, especially as I have been kind of in a slump and underwhelmed by a lot, probably just by my own brain recently. It is nice to celebrate the books that I really enjoyed. And most recently, the last book, well, it's no longer the last book I read, but One of the last books I read that I really, really enjoyed and loved was, actually, I have it here, Woodworm by Leila Martinez, translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott. This is gorgeous. A lot of these, actually, I think, nope, there will be one I won't have a Feature Friday on, but this one does have a Feature Friday. But this is a haunted house kind of narrative where not everything is as it appears, and it is odd and disturbing and haunted. So if you like weird fiction, you will definitely like this. And it's a novella, so that helps. Swinging back to the world of historical fiction with a slight mythical edge, I really enjoyed The Foxwife by Yangzi Chu this year. I need to swing back and read her second book, but I remember her first book, The Ghost Bride, which I need to reread, and I do think there's a movie I still haven't seen, but I remember loving that book. Like, that was one of the best books I ever got on the Barnes & Noble Discover New Writers Bay back when it came out, so it was a long time ago now. But to be fair, I haven't shopped the Bay for years. But I really enjoyed this book. It had elements almost of like some of the things I like in vampire fiction in it, in that we were following this group of fox spirits as they kind of came back into each other's lives, but it did have this kind of dual point of view, kind of dual plot timeline where we watch these two people's lives kind of converge and the circumstances of what was going on in their plot kind of come together. And it was just really well done. I also, as I mentioned in the Feature Friday for that book, really enjoyed how it explored the concept of aging and maturing in life. I really just thought it was beautiful and lyrical and loved it. Speaking of beautiful and lyrical, but in a much different way that has peaks of the absurd, You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrique. Now, I talked about this in my last monthly wrap-up, like March, because that was my last really stellar reading month, and I didn't do a Feature Friday on this book in particular because it is so kind of jam-packed, and there's no way I could even unpack or articulate even a fraction of this book. I definitely talk about it in more depth in that March wrap-up, but like with Enrique's Sudden Death, which I also really enjoyed, you are kind of just along for the ride. This one definitely, to my recollection of it in comparison with Sudden Death, felt like it had more plot kind of pushing things along because it is following the fall of the Aztec Empire. And I know this sounds incredibly disrespectful to say, but it is funny because it is looking at the absurdity of these empires, these being the Spanish and the Aztec on both sides, and the kind of hubris of these rulers and the kind of absurdity of these men in particular, and how it led to the downfall of this great civilization. And it just looks at that idea of, like, again, I go back to this idea of the hubris, especially kind of living in the modern moment, and it definitely feels in a lot of ways in conversation with the modern moment and how lives of everyday folk like you and I mean, I can speak for myself. I guess I cannot speak for you. You may not be. And if you are not, hey, welcome. But how we are just kind of at the mercy of the absurdity. Additionally, in this book, I talk a lot, or have talked a lot over the years, about the idea of things in books that I feel are there just for shock value in terms of like the grotesque or the uncomfortable, or specifically like body functions. And here those things are utilized, but in a way that is meant to shock, but fits within the world of the storytelling, and it feels purposeful other than being for shock value, if that makes sense. So it's just me saying I don't always dislike that thing. It's when it's used correctly, or, and I mean, this is all subjective, but in a way that is underscoring something rather than just trying to manipulate my emotions as a reader. So successful emotional manipulation as a reader. Now, speaking of absurd, we also have Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lenin, which takes place during the Peloponnesian War and is almost a kind of like Godot meets Christopher Moore, in that we are following these two unemployed potters, I believe, who decide that they are going to make the Athenian prisoners of war who are being kept in the quarry perform Euripides for them, specifically Medea, and eventually also the Trojan women. And so just kind of the farce that happens as these two are attempting to put on this show. And we are following the perspective of Lampo, who is not the brains of the operation if we just want to put it that way. So there is a lot of humor here, but there is also a lot of cultural commentary and just commentary in general. So go ahead and check out that Feature Friday too if you are interested. And finally, so I don't spend all day on just this piece, but again, I think it's important to celebrate the books that we liked. I really enjoyed as well the young adult novel Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear by Robin Wassley, which was a kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets The Rest of Us Just Live Here, which is already kind of a nesting doll, because when I read The Rest of Us Just Live Here, I specifically comped it to the episode of Buffy the Zeppo, and this is kind of living in the same world, and it's a teen apocalypse adventure with superpowers and a lot of heart and a lot of humor as well. And I think the balance of snark within this novel works really well, because even as a banter lover, sometimes the sarcasm and the snark and banter can go a little overboard in a way that overwhelms the rest of the storytelling, and here it doesn't, to me at least, feel like it's overwhelming the story, especially as it's also very evident that it is a kind of protective barrier, especially for our protagonist in terms of interacting with the rest of the world. And so as someone who hasn't been reading as much young adult recently as I have in the past, though I am reading a young adult right now and just reread a young adult, so I'm always contradicting myself, but I really enjoyed it. Now, the next question is best sequel you've read this year, which kind of put me into a spin because I realized I have not been reading sequels this year. I have not been reading series this year. And so there are definitely some sequels on my TBR that I need to get to that have come out this year, including like The Hemlock Queen by Hannah Witten. Let me know if you've read that and you think I need to prioritize that. But I have only read Isabel and the Rogue by Liana de la Rosa, which is a romance, and it is getting by sneaking in on a technicality because it is technically part of the Luna Sisters trilogy series. I mean, there's 3 of them, so both are applicable, but it is a romance, so it's shifting focus pretty drastically, though we do still get a lot of the sisters in this one, including Anna Maria, who we met in her book, which was the first in the series, so I think it still counts. That being said, the book itself is a Wallflower Rogue-esque novel that also has a spy element to it, which are all things I love, especially as it is in historical fiction, so is a lot of fun. And then we come to new releases you haven't read yet but want to which I say, see all of my anticipated release videos. But in terms of the most pressing, especially in terms of books that I own, I would say The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, which I bought on Indie Bookstore Day, and also promises to have elements of historical fiction with a bit of the mystical and the mythical. And then in terms of chunky novels, big books, we've got The Book of Love by Kelly Link. I am a fan of Kelly Link's short stories, though I have not yet finished her short story collection from last year. I've read 2 or 3, and I was not as into them as I have been to some of her other short stories in the past. That's neither here nor there, but this is her first novel, and I just am so intrigued by what this is going to be. But as someone who has been in the midst of a reading slump, the idea of tackling this just has been a little overwhelming for me. It's over 600 pages, but I'm so excited and intrigued to see what world she creates with this, and especially because what I love so much about her short stories is they do have those elements and like bits of the odd. And last year we got a novel from Mariana Enriquez, who is one of my favorite short story authors, if not my favorite at this point. I don't know. But one of the things I love so much about her stories is that they're dark and odd and twisted. And so that ended up being my favorite book of the year. So if Kelly Link can bring some of her same kind of weirdness and magic from her short stories and sustain it within this novel, this has a good chance of being my favorite book of the year. I just have to actually read it. So I need to get on that. That is, however, a great segue into the next question, which is my most anticipated release for the second half of the year, which is in fact a new Mariana Enriquez title. We are getting a new short story collection, A Sunny Place for Shady People, and I just think that title is so, so good. And I am ecstatic that we are getting this because, again, we just got Our Share of Night last year, which is a beast of a book. And I feel like her last collection, The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, didn't come out too far ahead of Our Share of Night. So I just feel very lucky to be getting more Enriquez within a year of that novel. I am getting slightly concerned about whether there will be more material to translate. Like, am I going to go through an Enriquez drought? Probably. But I will accept this gift as it is given to me. There are additionally a couple more books. Well, there are more than a couple more books that I'm looking forward to at the end of the year, but I'm gonna cheat again and mention just a few more. But the Mariana Enriquez right now is solidly the one I'm most excited for. And go ahead and tell me yours below, because I do feel like there is a big release or big releases that I am just completely forgetting. One of the big new releases that I am not forgetting is that we are getting a new Sally Rooney intermezzo. So I'm excited to see where Rooney continues to take us. Additionally, I am also excited for A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana, who is of course the author of A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which was just such a charming and cozy magical romance when it came out. And so I am very, very excited for another book that seems like it's going to be in that same world in terms of tone and coziness and heart. So very excited for this one as well, of course. And then we are getting a new Karen Marie Moning, The House at Watch Hill. So in addition to it being a new Karen Marie Moning, it is additionally like a haunted house gothic, which seems to be having a moment, and I am not mad about because I love that. But I have been reading Karen Marie Moning since I was a teenager. I have admittedly not finished the Fever series in that I haven't read the last 2 or 3 of them. There was a twist in the last book I read that just kind of made me throw things against the wall in terms of it feeling like it kind of unraveled the entire point of the original 5-book series. But I have been reading Moning since the Highlander romance series, and I'm really excited for a new world from her, and or to see if this world does kind of still touch upon her other worlds as well, in the way that the Fever series did bring in some of those characters from the Highland romance series, or if this is just a complete deviation. So just very interested to see a new direction here, though I have been admittedly out of the game for a second. And then I knew I was forgetting something, and of course it's one I already have pre-ordered, but An Academy of Liars by Alexis Henderson. Henderson has been an auto-buy author for me since the year of The Witching. She is also the author of House of Hunger, and this is a dark academia book from her. So I'm always excited for anything she gives me, but this is going to be another new world to explore. The next question is biggest disappointment, which unfortunately I have had some this year, and I always feel slightly bad talking about within this framing, but for the sake of transparency, let's do it. So right out of the gate, the only book I think I've DNF'd so far this year was Immortal Pleasures by V. Castro, which was set up to be a vampire novel and a kind of sensual vampire story to my interpretation of the original blurb, as well as having an anti-colonialism angle. And it had, or its main character was actually someone that I met as a reader in You Dreamed of Empires, and unfortunately I was much more interested in that character in You Dreamed of Empires because the voice of Immortal Pleasures just did not work for me. And I have not swung back and finished the V. Castro I started last year, but that's more my own fault. I was kind of shocked by the difference in voice between the two, or maybe I'm gonna have to go back and reassess. The voice in this was just very blunt, and it was telling me everything. By the 3rd paragraph, it was like, I'm so-and-so, and this is my whole deal. And it just didn't reveal anything to me organically, and that also took a lot of the mystery and the danger out of it. And instead, I was just really annoyed because it felt really sloppy. It was just telling me everything. And I've had a high barrier for tell versus show, I feel like, recently, and this was just particularly egregious, and I did eventually just have to put it down. Now, with that being said, the voice could have changed. Things could have changed in the narrative that changed my perspective on it, but it just felt so baked into the storytelling by like page 25 or so. Also, things hadn't really happened by that point, and anything that had happened was, again, our protagonist from her point of view, just telling us everything. And so even if things changed, it felt like a wasted opportunity at the beginning of the book to lead me as a reader to believe that that's how the voice operates. So I am leaving open that room for the margin of error. And again, I did not finish the book to have the full perspective of the book, but I was disappointed nonetheless because I was really, really looking forward to that book. In terms of books that I did finish that were just disappointing to me, Sure, I'll Join Your Cult by Maria Bamford, which I did on audio and may have been my first book of the year that I actually finished. I don't know, but I did not like it. I thought it was going to be kind of her exploring all of the different cults she has brushed up against, gotten involved with, in whatever fashion. And it wasn't. It was more her kind of making jokes and unpacking more of her kind of family trauma. But a lot of the jokes she was making really felt like they were punching down. Additionally, the cults or cult adjacent organizations that were explored were usually like 12-step programs. And I'm not above exploring them as cults, but we got like one mention of Scientology in the kind of intro. And then we didn't really delve into that world of cults ever again. And it felt more like she had pitched this really interesting concept in the tagline of what I thought I was going into in the book, in that it was a memoir framed by her exploration and kind of involvement with cults. And she was ultimately just kind of unable to deliver on that pitch. And I feel more comfortable saying that because she did have some lines in there kind of lamenting how hard it was to write a book, or how she was coming up against her deadline, or this, that, or the other, kind of a la the Amy Poehler book, which wasn't super well received when Amy Poehler did it, and I definitely did not appreciate it here. For biggest surprise, I think I would say Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear by Robin Wassley. I didn't go in not expecting to enjoy it because I picked it up, but I was just a lot more delighted with it than I even went in expecting. And I do think when I went in, I was a little hesitant in terms of how the humor would play out in it and if it would overpower the narrative. And I was really charmed. I really liked that book. I had a lot of fun, and it gets bonus points for a Manatee reference. In terms of favorite new author, I don't know that I've been reading a whole lot of new authors for me, and those that I have been reading and or debuts, I've been kind of underwhelmed by, unfortunately. However, I did just read Woodworm by Layla Martinez, and that really blew me away. And so I definitely have my eye on that author for how kind of dark and twisted, but also really insightful and succinct that book was. Additionally, Thirst by Marina Sasuzik, I think, introduces a really exciting voice as well. It balances a little bit differently, and its poetic language and use of voice definitely helps in it not feeling as didactic as the V. Castro did with Immortal Pleasures, because they are both vampire novels. And there are moments in Thirst where one of our protagonists is kind of relaying her history to us, but it's the history that informs her character rather than is fully driving her character, and I do think it balances it just a little bit better. Additionally, I just liked the voice a lot more, so I definitely have my eye on both of those authors, and there are definitely a bunch of authors that I want to check out yet this year. Now, the next question is newest fictional crush, which as a reader of romance, you would think would be incredibly easy for me, but I don't know if none of the romance heroes I've read this year have like stood out to me on their own, or I'm just incapable of divorcing them from their partner and the relationship they're in and how that works. But I don't think I'm crushing on any of them. And so this was actually really hard. I was like, I don't know that I have a fictional crush. And I don't think I have a fictional crush in the spirit that this question probably exists in. I don't have any like book boyfriends or anything, but I did very much enjoy Matteo Andoni from A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal, who is the kind of snarky vampire, the kind of laissez-faire one who is quick to throw out a sarcastic comment, and I do think has been set up with our protagonist in that book in a triangle. And I don't know, the way I am reading the book right now, all of my, young adult instincts are telling me that's not the way the trilogy is aiming to go. It's aiming to go with like the angstier love interest, but for once in my life, I am not picking angst. I am picking the snarky and sarcastic vampire in a corner. And honestly, I do feel like I could be proven wrong in this one based on how it's set up. In terms of maybe my ship will sail, but in terms of book boyfriend, it may be a stretch. I don't know that I have any real book boyfriends or fictional crushes in the first half of this reading year, but we still have a whole nother 6 months to go, so that could still change. Now, conversely, in terms of newest favorite character, I feel like I was introduced to a lot of really interesting and dynamic and flawed characters this year, but I would say maybe the most interesting to me were Lampo and Gellin from Glorious Exploits, because they were so humorous and flawed, and they were set up as kind of everymen in the least flattering way, which made me as a reader, and in theory is meant to make us as readers, really look internally at how we act in a lot of circumstances where this is a heightened circumstance, but it's a heightened circumstance that is a lot more reflective of modern circumstances than we would like to believe, though no one, to my knowledge, is putting on productions of Euripides in a stone quarry. But again, these characters, particularly Lampo, are just kind of absurd. Gellin is kind of more the straight player against Lampo's absurdity, but it is still a really nice balance, and it's particularly interesting that we are in Lampo's point of view when you would think that Gellin, based on the narrative, would be the more sympathetic point of view. And so it's just really interesting how the entire novel was approached, and I just found these two characters, even amidst the heightened state of that book and nature of that narrative, I found those two characters really interesting, which is good because I do think it is much more of a character-driven novel than a plot-driven novel. Like, we've got this central conceit that is kind of driving everything, but it's really about these characters and the circumstances that they're finding themselves in. So it's good that they were interesting and entertaining to spend time with. Okay, next we have a book that made you cry. And at first I was like, I don't think any book this year has made me cry, which is more a reflection on my emotional distance and the fact that I probably haven't read as much as usual this year. And then I was like, well, that's a big old fat lie, because The Warm Hands of Ghosts, while it feels like I read years ago, I technically read this year, and that 100% made me cry in multiple different sections. Now, conversely, the next question is a book that made you happy. And I'm interpreting this as like a book that made you like giggling, kicking your feet, squealing kind of happy, which admittedly doesn't feel reflective of my reading experience so far this year. But The Foxwife by Yang Zichu did make me happy in the sense that I really enjoyed the characters, and I really enjoyed the way the book blended that historical fiction or the historical elements with the mythical elements and the kind of folklore in a way that was really seamless and scratched that itch for me as a reader that I feel like I've been feeling a little bit more recently and have been disappointed by other novels in, and I just really enjoyed that book. And so in that sense, it absolutely made me happy. And like I said, I also really enjoyed the characters and its depiction and illustration of aging. And so I guess based on the definition, that book absolutely made me happy. Now that brings us to favorite book to film adaptation for the year so far, but I have only watched Bridgerton season 3 in terms of adaptation, so that's not really a fair question to answer. However, I did just finish my reread of My Lady Jane, and so hopefully tonight I am going to tuck in and watch My Lady Jane, because that is a book I loved a whole lot when it came out, and can confirm after my reread I still very much love, and so I'm very excited to see it translated to the screen, and I'm kind of ashamed that I didn't even have it on my radar until the last month or two. Otherwise, I absolutely would have started that reread much sooner, but we got there in the end. I'm gonna watch it, and we will also surely circle back and talk about it here as well, so stay tuned for that. Next is favorite video you've done so far this year, and I'm actually pretty pleased with a lot of the videos I've done this year, and I'm definitely pleased with especially your reception to the Bridgerton videos this year. Primarily, I really enjoyed doing the Psyche and Eros analysis of Bridgerton, which was not at all a video I anticipated to make like going into the season. And similarly, I think my favorite video that I've done so far this year, or the most fun I kind of had going down like mental side roads, was my video I did for the Taylor Swift album, The Tortured Poets Department, analyzing the Tortured Poets Department through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics. And again, when I sat down to listen to that album, that is never the video I would have anticipated making. I anticipated making a video that was, you know, books to read based on specific songs on the album, but as I was listening, I just couldn't get the idea of Aristotle and the Poetics and the idea of Greek tragedy out of my head, and even more specifically, the idea of the Greek chorus. And so that all led me to creating the video, The Tortured Poetics, which is an exploration of the Tortured Poets Department through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics. And if you haven't watched that video, I think it's a lot of fun. It is a fun kind of mental jaunt, and you should definitely go on that mental jaunt if you feel so inclined. That being said, there are a lot of videos this year that I had a lot of fun with, so definitely circle back and check some of those out if you haven't and that sounds of interest to you. But I have been having a lot of fun this year, and amidst that fun, I do of course want to thank those of you who have been with me for this ride so far, or who have jumped on the ride recently. I appreciate all of you being here so that I can have fun and I can go on mental tangents and kind of just indulge those niche interests in addition to talking about specific book titles and digging deeper into specific books, because I do still really value, especially like my Feature Fridays and specific book reviews as well, in terms of how I talk about books on this channel and how we talk about books on this channel. But with all that being said, now would also be a great time for you to give me feedback if you feel like it, in terms of some of the videos that you've really enjoyed this year, or things you may want to or like to see more of or think I should try. Let me know and we'll see what we can do. Next question is most beautiful book you bought or received this year. I have not been buying a lot of books this year. I kind of tried to rein myself in. I'm doing really good, too good really, at the library holds. So I don't know that I have a lot of like special editions or like gorgeous books to show you. I think, you know, I've got, you know, the black edges on the Familiar, but I had this on the original Six of Crows as well. I do actually really like, as much kind of shit as I've talked about the fact that this novella is a hardcover and that it is white, which is the bane of my existence in a lot of ways. I do love the cover and I do think it is an aesthetically pleasing book. It is a pretty book if you're going to charge me $22 for this. I wish it weren't white, but otherwise, I do think it delivers. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit and show you a book that I was gifted last fall by one of my best friends, because two of my friends went to Korea and one of them came back with a book for me. The other one came back with a makeup palette that also had a light up cheese in it. So really, I'm not picking favorites here by any means, but this is a gorgeous edition of Little Women, and we did determine that this is a serialized edition. I have a short kind of like looking at this, but it is just part of Little Women, the first however many chapters. So it's the first installment. So it is not abridged, but serialized to my assessment. But that assessment is limited by the fact that I do not read or speak Korean, but I love the image on the front here. I love that we've got the really deep French flap. Oh, I just absolutely threw off the white balance, didn't I? And we're back. But I also really love just the page layout of this edition, the typography. I think it is really pretty and it's just really cute. It's like a wee Little Women, and so it sits right on top. And then the final question is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? Which feels kind of like a repeat of what new releases have you not read this year and still want to get to, but I do feel like the spirit of the question could be slightly different. I do think the better question is, what books don't I need to read this year? But there probably are some books that I really should bump up higher on the list. I really should finally read A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross, which is the sequel to A River Enchanted, which I loved, you know, years ago. It was one of my favorites of like 2022. I don't even remember. Anyway, I also feel like I need to read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil because The Goodman currently has a musical production of that, and I was kind of hoping to read and go see it, similarly to how I did for Villette or Villette by Charlotte Bronte last year. And I also have a college classmate who was in that production. Also, we are getting Wicked this year, and they have been very vocal about the fact that they are adding more from the book back in. And I have not read the original novel, the Gregory Maguire, since middle school, I would say, which I know is wild if you've read Wicked, but also not out of character. And so I probably need to revisit that. Let me know if you are interested in doing a read along for that, similarly to how we did for Bridgerton. I know we've kind of pulled back. I would love to do some more romance read alongs potentially, but with it being summer, I have to have my window unit in, and so live streaming just probably isn't as realistic during the summer months, but that is an option. And speaking of romances, I also need to read and or finish reading the romances that I have been revisiting in order to do a follow-up of Wallflower Romance Rex in relation to Bridgerton Season 3. And so a lot of these books are clearly motivated by video ideas as well, but is also further illustration that my videos right now are more limited by time than imagination. You know, with a full-time job, with a social life, things do fall through the cracks sometimes, or some things have to get put on the back burner or inadvertently fall to the back burner. But if any of that sounds of particular interest to you, please let me know so I can try to prioritize it. But with that, that is kind of where we're sitting. Now, again, the last 3 months have been kind of odd for me in terms of reading, and that I've been reading a lot less than I'm used to, a lot slower than I'm used to, which again is just kind of the ebbs and flows of life and circumstances, and it's fine, but I do feel like I'm not as in the game as I like to be. And so I'm hoping to be able to read some more books this third quarter, as there are so many this year I've been anticipating, and so many from prior years that I have been anticipating that I still need to circle back to and get to. There are just, you know, always too many books to read. But let me know how your reading year has been going. Again, if you have very strong responses to any of the prompt questions, let me know what your books for that are. But also, like I said, if you have any thoughts related to things you'd like to see from the channel, let me know. And this is a good, I think, check-in time to kind of gauge that. Though again, I will take everything into consideration, but I can't make any promises, especially with the balance of daily life, but very interested in what you are interested in and what you would like to see or what has been resonating. But I'm just really happy that you're here and that we are at another mid-year point of talking about books. I am very grateful for the last however many years that I have been able to talk about books on this channel, and here's to however many more. But thank you for being here for whatever part of it, whether it's just today or you've been here longer. I appreciate you being interested in my thoughts, and thank you for hanging out. If you haven't, go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.